The morning mist clung to the Arno River like the ghosts of Florence's past, and Niccolo Machiavelli stood at his window, quill trembling in his weathered hand. The year was 1513, and the republic he had served with unwavering loyalty lay in ruins beneath the iron fist of the Medici Restoration. His own fall from grace served as a bitter testament to the very principles he would soon commit to parchment. Principles that would echo through the corridors of power for centuries to come. The study around him bore witness to sleepless nights spent wrestling with uncomfortable truths. Scattered manuscripts covered every surface, each page a meditation on the brutal mathematics of governance. Here, in this cramped room overlooking the city that had cast him out, Machiavelli began to understand what historians would later call his ultimate caution. That kindness, however noble in intention, carries a price that rulers can rarely afford to pay. The genesis of this revelation traced back to the Republic's final days, when Piero Soderini, the well-meaning gonfaloniere, had chosen mercy over decisive action time and again. Soderini's genuine compassion for his fellow citizens, his reluctance to employ harsh measures even against proven enemies of the state, had created the very weakness that ambitious men like Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici exploited with surgical precision. The Restoration had swept through Florence not like a conquering army, but like water finding every crack that kindness had opened in the Republic's foundation. Machiavelli's pen scratched across the parchment as he recorded his observations, each word weighted with the gravity of experience. He had witnessed firsthand how the cardinal, later to become Pope Leo X, had manipulated Soderini's merciful nature. The future pontiff had appeared before the gonfaloniere not as a conquering enemy but as a penitent son of Florence seeking reconciliation. Soderini, moved by what he perceived as genuine contrition, had extended the hand of friendship to the very man who would orchestrate his downfall. The mechanisms of this manipulation revealed themselves to Machiavelli with crystalline clarity. Cardinal de' Medici had understood something that the good-hearted Soderini never grasped, that mercy shown to enemies is often interpreted not as strength tempered by compassion, but as weakness masquerading as virtue. The cardinal had studied his opponent's character with the patience of a spider observing a fly, noting every instance where kindness had stayed Soderini's hand when decisive action would have better served the Republic's interests. In the taverns and piazzas of Florence, Machiavelli had listened to the whispered conversations of citizens who had initially supported Soderini's gentle approach to governance. These same people, faced with the uncertainty that kindness had created, began to yearn for the stability that only firm leadership could provide. They spoke longingly of Lorenzo the Magnificent, remembering not his occasional cruelties but the order and prosperity that had marked his reign. The human heart, Machiavelli realized, craves security above all else and will trade away freedom for the promise of protection from chaos. The Florentine secretary began to document a pattern that extended far beyond the borders of his beloved city-state. Throughout the Italian peninsula, rulers who governed with excessive kindness found themselves vulnerable to those who understood power's true nature. In Milan, Ludovico Sforza had maintained his position not through benevolence but through a carefully calibrated mixture of generosity and ruthlessness, ensuring that potential threats were eliminated before they could mature into actual dangers. The French invasions had provided additional evidence for Machiavelli's emerging thesis. King Louis XII, despite his military advantages, had failed to establish lasting control over Italian territories precisely because he had tried to rule through local consensus rather than direct authority. His attempts to placate various factions had merely created opportunities for rivals like Ferdinand of Aragon and Pope Julius II to exploit French weaknesses. The king's kindness to former enemies had been repaid with betrayal at every turn, proving that gratitude, unlike fear, dissipates with time and changing circumstances. These historical examples began to coalesce in Machiavelli's mind into a broader understanding of human nature. He observed that people, when faced with authority, respond more consistently to the fear of punishment than to the hope of reward. This was not because humans were inherently evil, but because fear addressed an immediate and tangible concern, while kindness often seemed abstract and unreliable. A ruler's mercy might be withdrawn at any moment, but his capacity for punishment remained a constant threat that shaped behavior even in his absence. The psychological insights that emerged from Machiavelli's observations cut deep into comfortable assumptions about leadership and morality. He noted how subjects of kind rulers often pushed boundaries, testing the limits of that kindness until they found the point where patience transformed into anger. This testing behavior created an inevitable dynamic where mercy had to be withdrawn precisely when it was most needed to maintain order. Conversely, rulers who established firm boundaries from the beginning rarely faced such challenges because their subjects understood the consequences of transgression from the outset. The economic implications of excessive kindness also demanded Machiavelli's attention. Florence's fiscal troubles under Soderini had stemmed partly from the Gonfaloniers' reluctance to impose necessary but unpopular taxes on wealthy citizens. His desire to maintain harmonious relationships with the merchant class had prevented him from addressing the Republic's mounting debts, ultimately weakening the state's ability to defend itself against external threats. The Medici, upon their return, had shown no such hesitation in extracting the resources they needed, proving that effective governance sometimes required actions that individual citizens might find harsh but that served the greater good of state survival. Religious considerations added another layer of complexity to Machiavelli's analysis. The Christian emphasis on mercy and forgiveness, while admirable in personal relationships, created dangerous expectations when applied to statecraft. Citizens raised on these values expected their rulers to mirror divine compassion, yet the practical demands of governance often required actions that contradicted religious teachings. This tension placed virtuous rulers like Soderini in an impossible position. Caught between their spiritual convictions and their political responsibilities, the international dimensions of kindness proved equally problematic in Machiavelli's assessment. Diplomatic relations required a delicate balance between cooperation and competition, and excessive generosity in negotiations often signaled weakness that rival states were quick to exploit. The Republic of Venice had maintained its independence for centuries, not through kindness to its neighbors, but through a sophisticated understanding of when to fight, when to negotiate, and when to form strategic alliances based on mutual action. Machiavelli's correspondence with his friend Francesco Vittori during this period revealed the personal anguish that accompanied these insights. The former secretary struggled with the gap between his natural inclinations toward compassion and his intellectual understanding of power's requirements. His letters describe nights spent walking the hills around San Cassiano, wrestling with the implications of his observations and the responsibility he felt to share these uncomfortable truths with future generations of rulers. The manuscript that emerged from these midnight contemplations bore little resemblance to the political treatises of earlier eras. Where previous writers had focused on ideal states and perfect princes, Machiavelli grounded his analysis in observable human behavior and documented historical outcomes. His approach was empirical rather than theoretical, drawing conclusions from what actually happened rather than what moral philosophers believed should happen. The price of kindness, as Machiavelli began to articulate it, was not simply political weakness but the eventual destruction of the very qualities that kindness was meant to protect. A ruler's excessive mercy toward criminals emboldened lawlessness that ultimately harmed innocent citizens. Diplomatic generosity that was not reciprocated led to international isolation and potential conquest. Economic policies driven more by compassion than fiscal responsibility resulted in state bankruptcy that impoverished the entire population. Yet Machiavelli was careful to distinguish between foolish sentimentality and strategic benevolence. He had observed how successful rulers like Cesare Borgia employed calculated acts of kindness to achieve specific political objectives, never allowing mercy to become a predictable pattern that enemies could exploit. The Duke's ability to shift between generosity and severity, always keeping his subjects uncertain about which response their actions would provoke, had proven remarkably effective in maintaining order and loyalty. The psychological insight that emerged from these observations was that humans respect power they cannot fully predict or control, while they gradually lose respect for authority that becomes too familiar or reliable. This principle applied to parents managing children, merchants dealing with customers, and generals commanding armies, but it carried special weight in the realm of statecraft, where the stakes of miscalculation could include the survival of entire populations. Machiavelli's analysis began to crystallize around a central paradox, that rulers who wished to preserve good governance must occasionally act in ways that appeared evil, while those who insisted on always appearing virtuous would ultimately create conditions that produced genuine evil. The Gonfalonier's kindness had not prevented suffering, but had merely delayed and concentrated it, allowing problems to fester until they required more severe remedies than would have been necessary if addressed earlier. The document that would eventually become The Prince began to take shape as Machiavelli recognized that his insights carried implications far beyond the immediate political situation in Florence. He was mapping the fundamental tension between private morality and public responsibility, between individual virtue and collective survival, between the ideals that make life worth living and the realities that make life possible. The price of kindness, he understood, was not paid by rulers alone, but by entire societies that suffered when their leaders proved unable or unwilling to make difficult decisions. The ultimate caution was not against kindness itself, but against the naive belief that good intentions were sufficient to produce good outcomes in the unforgiving arena of political power. Part 2. The Laboratory of Power. The year that followed Machiavelli's initial revelations transformed his theoretical insights into a comprehensive examination of power's fundamental nature. Through careful study of contemporary events and historical precedents, he began to construct what would become one of the most enduring analyses of political leadership ever written. The laboratory for his observations was not confined to Florence, but extended across the Italian peninsula, where warfare, diplomacy, and intrigue provided abundant evidence for his emerging thesis about the price of kindness. The case of Cesare Borgia proved particularly instructive in demonstrating the practical application of Machiavelli's principles. The Duke's campaign in the Romagna had been marked by calculated alternations between generosity and severity that kept both allies and enemies in a constant state of uncertainty. When Borgia first entered Imola, he had shown considerable kindness to the local population, reducing taxes and promising protection from rival factions. This initial generosity had won him genuine support from citizens who had suffered under previous rulers' neglect and exploitation. However, Borgia's true mastery revealed itself in his response to the conspiracy at Senigallia, where several of his former allies had plotted against him. Rather than responding with immediate violence, the Duke had invited the conspirators to a feast, treating them with apparent warmth and forgiveness. Only when they had relaxed their guard, convinced that his kindness indicated weakness, had he struck with devastating efficiency. The conspirators were arrested during the celebration and executed before dawn, sending a clear message about the consequences of betrayal while demonstrating that the Duke's previous mercy had been a strategic choice rather than a character weakness. This incident illustrated Machiavelli's growing understanding that effective rulers must cultivate what he termed calculated unpredictability. Citizens and rivals alike needed to understand that kindness could be withdrawn as quickly as it was granted, making every act of mercy appear as a gift that demanded gratitude rather than an entitlement that encouraged further demands. The Duke's reputation for both generosity and ruthlessness created a psychological dynamic where subjects competed for his favor rather than taking his goodwill for granted. The contrast with Pope Julius II's approach provided additional evidence for Machiavelli's thesis. The warrior pope's consistent aggression had made him predictable to his enemies, who learned to anticipate and counter his military campaigns. While Julius's unwavering hostility had prevented others from exploiting his kindness, it had also limited his options for diplomatic maneuvering. Rulers who relied exclusively on fear found themselves trapped by their own reputations, unable to form the strategic alliances that more flexible leaders could create through selective applications of mercy and severity. French politics offered another rich source of material for Machiavelli's analysis. King Louis XII's failures in Italy had stemmed partly from his inability to understand that different populations required different approaches to governance. His attempt to rule Italian city-states according to French customs had created resentment among local elites who interpreted his uniformly kind treatment as a sign that he neither understood nor respected their particular traditions and concerns. The king's good intentions had been undermined by his failure to recognize that effective kindness required cultural sensitivity and local knowledge. The economic dimensions of Machiavelli's observations proved equally revealing. The Medici bank's operations across Europe demonstrated how commercial success required a sophisticated understanding of when to extend credit generously and when to demand immediate payment. Lorenzo de' Medici's grandfather, Cosimo, had built the family's fortune through strategic loans to European monarchs, showing kindness when it served long-term interests while demanding harsh repayment terms when borrowers appeared unreliable. This commercial model provided a template for political leadership that balanced generosity with accountability. Venice's maritime empire offered perhaps the most sophisticated example of strategic kindness in action. The Republic's governors in distant territories had developed elaborate protocols for managing local populations that combined genuine care for colonial subjects with unwavering enforcement of Venetian authority. Colonial administrators were trained to identify and reward local leaders who supported Venetian interests, while isolating and neutralizing those who posed potential threats. This systematic approach to colonial governance had allowed Venice to maintain control over territories far from the lagoon for centuries, proving that kindness could be both genuine and strategically effective when properly implemented. The psychological insights that emerged from these comparative studies led Machiavelli to develop what might be called a typology of human response to authority. He identified several distinct categories of subjects, each requiring different combinations of kindness and severity to manage effectively. Natural supporters could be maintained through consistent but not excessive generosity, while committed opponents required either elimination or such overwhelming demonstrations of power that continued resistance became impossible. The largest and most important group consisted of uncommitted citizens whose loyalty could be won or lost depending on their perception of the ruler's effectiveness and reliability. This middle group's behavior patterns revealed the fundamental irony at the heart of Machiavelli's analysis. Citizens who were treated with consistent kindness gradually raised their expectations, becoming dissatisfied when that kindness failed to solve all their problems. Conversely, subjects who experienced occasional severity followed by merciful treatment often developed stronger loyalty than those who received uniform good treatment. The psychological principle at work was similar to what later researchers would identify in studies of reinforcement schedules. Intermittent rewards created more persistent behavioral patterns than consistent ones. The military applications of these insights proved particularly valuable in understanding why certain commanders succeeded where others failed. Armies led by consistently harsh commanders often suffered from low morale and high desertion rates, while those under excessively kind leadership frequently lacked discipline and fighting effectiveness. The most successful military leaders, like Prospero Colonna and Francesco Sforza, had developed reputations for treating their soldiers well during peacetime while maintaining absolute authority during combat operations. This dual approach created military units that fought effectively because they trusted their commander's judgment and feared the consequences of disobedience. Diplomatic negotiations provided another arena where the price of kindness became clearly visible. Ambassadors who approached their counterparts with excessive generosity often found themselves taken advantage of, as rival negotiators interpreted kindness as evidence of weakness in the positions they represented. Conversely, diplomats who were too aggressive created adversarial relationships that prevented the cooperation necessary for successful treaty-making. The most effective negotiations occurred when representatives could credibly threaten harsh consequences while offering genuine benefits for cooperation. The temporal aspects of kindness also demanded careful consideration. Machiavelli observed that mercy shown early in a ruler's tenure was often interpreted differently than the same actions taken after authority had been firmly established. New rulers who immediately demonstrated kindness risked being seen as weak, while established leaders could afford to be more generous because their capacity for severity had already been proven. This timing consideration explained why successful coups often began with displays of force before transitioning to more merciful policies once resistance had been eliminated. Religious institutions provided compelling case studies in the strategic use of mercy and severity. The Catholic Church's approach to heresy demonstrated how spiritual authority could maintain its effectiveness through careful calibration of punishment and forgiveness. The Inquisition's harsh treatment of unrepentant heretics served to make the Church's mercy toward those who confessed and recanted appear more valuable and meaningful. This dynamic created incentives for compliance that pure kindness could never have achieved, while pure severity would have generated such resentment that the Church's spiritual authority would have been undermined. The analysis extended beyond individual rulers to examine how entire governmental systems manage the balance between mercy and justice. Republican institutions, like those in Florence and Venice, had developed complex procedures for ensuring that kindness did not undermine legal authority while preventing severity from becoming arbitrary tyranny. The use of councils, appeals processes, and term limits created checks against both excessive mercy and unrestricted cruelty, though Machiavelli noted that these systems often moved too slowly to address urgent threats effectively. Legal systems across Italy provided additional evidence for Machiavelli's thesis about the price of kindness. Courts that consistently imposed lenient sentences found themselves dealing with increased criminal activity, as potential lawbreakers calculated that the benefits of crime outweighed the minimal risks of punishment. Conversely, judicial systems that were excessively harsh created social tensions that sometimes erupted into broader violence. The most effective legal frameworks maintained reputations for fairness while ensuring that punishments were severe enough to deter most criminal behavior. The international implications of these domestic observations became increasingly clear as Machiavelli studied relationships between Italian city-states and foreign powers. Spain's growing influence in southern Italy demonstrated how consistent policies that combined selective kindness with credible threats could gradually expand control over neighboring territories. Spanish administrators had learned to identify local leaders who could be co-opted through generous treatment, while eliminating those who posed insurmountable obstacles to Spanish authority. This systematic approach to expansion proved far more effective than the random violence that characterized many military conquests. The emerging Ottoman threat on Europe's southeastern frontier provided another lens through which to examine the strategic dimensions of mercy and severity. Ottoman expansion had succeeded partly because their administrators were trained to offer generous terms to cities that surrendered without resistance while implementing devastating punishments on those that chose to fight. This policy created strong incentives for submission that reduced the costs of conquest while demonstrating to potential future targets that cooperation would be rewarded. The psychological effect of this approach had proven so powerful that many European territories surrendered without fighting, calculating that Ottoman rule offered better prospects than continued resistance. As Machiavelli's analysis deepened, he began to understand that the price of kindness was not simply political or military, but fundamentally moral. Rulers who insisted on maintaining their personal virtue in all circumstances often created conditions that increased suffering for their subjects. The Gonfaloniers' reluctance to employ harsh measures against Florence's enemies had ultimately resulted in conquest and occupation that proved far more damaging to the city's residents than decisive early action would have been. This insight forced Machiavelli to confront the uncomfortable possibility that private virtue and public responsibility might sometimes be fundamentally incompatible. Part 3. The Eternal Paradox. The final phase of Machiavelli's investigation led him into philosophical territories that few political theorists had dared to explore. As his manuscript neared completion in the winter of 1513, the former secretary found himself grappling not just with practical questions of governance, but with fundamental paradoxes about the nature of human society itself. The price of kindness, he had discovered, was embedded in the very structure of political life. creating dilemmas that could be managed but never fully resolved. The case that crystallized these insights came from his study of papal politics, where temporal and spiritual authority intersected in ways that illuminated the deepest tensions between private morality and public responsibility. Pope Alexander VI, Cesare Borgia's father, had scandalized Europe through his personal conduct while simultaneously strengthening the papacy's political position in ways that benefited millions of Catholics. His successor, Julius II, had maintained better personal morals while pursuing military campaigns that brought enormous suffering to Italian populations. The comparison forced Machiavelli to consider whether the conventional relationship between private virtue and public good might be fundamentally reversed in positions of ultimate authority. This reversal of expectations extended beyond individual cases to encompass entire systems of thought about leadership and responsibility. Traditional Christian teaching emphasized the importance of mercy, forgiveness, and turning the other cheek, virtues that worked well in personal relationships but could prove disastrous when applied to statecraft. A ruler who forgave his enemies repeatedly might be demonstrating admirable personal virtue while creating conditions that endangered every citizen under his protection. Conversely, a leader who eliminated threats decisively might be committing personal sins while fulfilling his primary obligation to preserve the Commonwealth. The philosophical implications of this insight troubled Machiavelli deeply, as evidenced by the increasingly complex revisions he made to his manuscript during the winter months. He was not simply arguing for cynical pragmatism over naive idealism, but identifying a fundamental structural problem in how societies had traditionally thought about the relationship between morality and politics. The assumption that good intentions would naturally produce good outcomes had been proven false by centuries of historical evidence. Yet political discourse continued to be dominated by writers who ignored this evidence in favor of theoretical constructs that bore little resemblance to actual human behavior. The psychological dimensions of this paradox proved equally challenging to resolve. Subjects wanted their rulers to be both merciful and effective, demanding contradictory qualities that no single individual could consistently provide. Citizens praised leaders for showing mercy to defeated enemies while simultaneously criticizing them if those same enemies later posed renewed threats. This impossible standard created a dynamic where successful rulers had to accept being misunderstood and sometimes hated for actions that served the greater good of their societies. International relations provided the starkest examples of how good intentions could produce catastrophic results. The Peace of Lodi had been negotiated by rulers with genuine desires for harmony among Italian city-states, yet the treaty's kindness toward previously hostile powers had created a power vacuum that French and Spanish armies had rushed to fill. The well-meaning attempts to avoid conflict through diplomatic generosity had instead created conditions that made much larger and more devastating wars inevitable. This pattern repeated itself across Europe whenever leaders prioritized immediate harmony over long-term stability. The economic analysis that emerged from these observations revealed similar paradoxes in commercial and fiscal policy. Rulers who showed excessive kindness to their subjects by keeping taxes low often found themselves unable to fund the military forces necessary to protect those same subjects from external threats. Conversely, leaders who imposed harsh fiscal burdens in order to maintain strong defenses were frequently criticized for their cruelty, even when their policies prevented invasions that would have been far more costly in both economic and human terms. Venice's long-term success in managing these competing demands provided Machiavelli with a model for how the paradoxes of kindness might be addressed, if not resolved. The Republic's constitution had distributed decision-making authority among multiple institutions in ways that allowed different aspects of governance to be handled by different groups. The Doge could maintain a reputation for mercy and wisdom, while the Council of Ten made harsh decisions about state security. This division of labor enabled the Republic to appear both kind and effective while ensuring that necessary but unpopular actions could still be taken when circumstances required them. The psychological sophistication of this approach impressed Machiavelli because it recognized that human beings needed to maintain faith in the possibility of merciful governance while accepting the reality that effective authority sometimes required harsh measures. By creating institutional structures that separated these functions, Venice had found a way to preserve both the appearance and the reality of good government without falling into the trap of excessive kindness that had destroyed less sophisticated political systems. The study of successful conspiracies revealed another dimension of the kindness paradox that had important implications for understanding political stability. Plots against rulers typically succeeded when the targets had become predictably kind in their responses to threats, allowing conspirators to calculate risks accurately and plan accordingly. Leaders who maintained reputations for unpredictable severity faced fewer conspiracies because potential plotters could not be certain how their actions would be received. This insight suggested that a certain amount of fear was necessary for political survival, not because rulers enjoyed inspiring terror, but because predictable kindness created vulnerabilities that ambitious individuals would inevitably exploit. The religious foundations of European political thought created additional complications that Machiavelli struggled to address satisfactorily. Christianity's emphasis on mercy and forgiveness had become so deeply embedded in political discourse that rulers who acted according to practical necessity rather than spiritual ideals were automatically condemned as immoral, regardless of the outcomes their policies produced. This moral framework made it difficult for political leaders to develop realistic strategies for managing complex challenges, because acknowledging the limitations of kindness was interpreted as rejecting fundamental religious principles. The solution that gradually emerged from Machiavelli's analysis involved a radical separation between the ethical standards appropriate for private life and those necessary for public responsibility. Individuals could and should strive to be merciful, forgiving, and generous in their personal relationships, but these same virtues became dangerous when applied to situations where the welfare of entire communities was at stake. This distinction required rulers to develop what might be called a dual moral consciousness, maintaining their personal virtue while accepting responsibility for actions that might violate conventional ethical standards. The practical implementation of this dual consciousness demanded extraordinary psychological strength and sophistication. Rulers had to make decisions that they knew would be criticized and misunderstood while maintaining enough emotional distance from their actions to avoid becoming corrupted by the power they wielded. The history of successful leaders suggested that this balance was extremely difficult to achieve and maintain over time. Many rulers who began with good intentions gradually became genuinely cruel as the psychological toll of making harsh decisions eroded their capacity for genuine mercy. The temporal aspects of political kindness also required careful consideration in developing sustainable approaches to governance. Actions that appeared kind in the short term often produced suffering in the long term, while decisions that seemed harsh initially frequently created conditions for lasting peace and prosperity. The challenge for rulers was to maintain enough popular support to remain in power while implementing policies that might not show their benefits for years or decades. This temporal mismatch between political accountability and policy effectiveness created pressures that few leaders could successfully navigate. The international dimensions of these challenges became increasingly apparent as Machiavelli completed his analysis. European politics was entering a period of unprecedented competition between emerging nation-states, each seeking to expand its influence at the expense of its neighbors. In this environment, rulers who showed excessive kindness to foreign powers were likely to find their own territories conquered and their subjects enslaved. The price of kindness was no longer simply domestic instability, but potential national extinction. The manuscript that emerged from these years of observation and reflection represented something unprecedented in political literature. Rather than offering idealized visions of perfect governance, Machiavelli had documented the actual dilemmas that real rulers faced and analyzed the trade-offs that effective leadership required. His work was neither purely cynical nor naively optimistic, but rather an attempt to understand politics as it actually existed rather than as moral philosophers believed it should exist. The ultimate caution that gave the work its title was not a warning against kindness itself, but against the dangerous assumption that good intentions were sufficient to produce good outcomes in political life. Rulers who wished to preserve the conditions that made kindness possible had to be prepared to act with temporary harshness when those conditions were threatened. The paradox was inescapable. To maintain a society where mercy could flourish, leaders sometimes had to act mercilessly. The price of kindness, Machiavelli concluded, was not paid in political currency alone, but in the fundamental human cost of responsibility. Leaders who truly cared about their subjects' welfare had to accept being hated for actions that served the greater good, while those who insisted on maintaining their personal popularity often created conditions that produced far greater suffering than their harsh policies would have caused. The burden of effective leadership was not simply making difficult decisions, but living with the knowledge that those decisions would be misunderstood and condemned by the very people they were intended to protect. As winter gave way to spring in 1514, Machiavelli completed his analysis with a sense of both satisfaction and melancholy. He had succeeded in documenting truths about political life that previous writers had either ignored or misunderstood. But those truths offered cold comfort to anyone who hoped for simple answers to complex questions. The relationship between kindness and effective governance would remain a source of tension as long as human societies required leadership, and future rulers would face the same impossible choices that had confronted their predecessors throughout history. The document he had created would outlive its author by centuries, influencing political thought in ways that he could never have imagined. Yet its central insight remained as relevant in the distant future as it was in Renaissance Italy, that the price of kindness in political life was eternal vigilance against the human tendency to mistake good intentions for effective action. The ultimate caution was not against compassion, but against the comfortable illusion that virtue could govern without understanding power's true requirements. The manuscript ended where it had begun, with Machiavelli standing at his window overlooking Florence, contemplating the eternal tension between what people wished their leaders could be and what effective governance actually required. The price of kindness would continue to be paid by rulers and subjects alike, generation after generation, as long as human societies struggled to balance their highest aspirations with their most basic needs for security and order. The caution was ultimate because the choice was eternal, and no amount of wisdom or good intentions could eliminate the tragic necessity of choosing between competing goods in the unforgiving arena of political power.